Welcome to the podcast Road to Inclusion from the Atlas Alliance. In this podcast series, we'll cover themes such as disability rights, disability inclusion, the empowerment of persons with disabilities, inclusive international development aid, and disability inclusive humanitarian action. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new and exciting episode of a podcast, Road to Inclusion from the Atlas Alliance. I'm your host, Gagan Shabra. I'm the project manager for inclusion at the Atlas Alliance. And today we have a fantastic guest who is joining us digitally. He's an international guest, Dominic Haslam, the chairperson of IDDC, International Disability and Development Consortium, and the director of policy and strategy at the Sightsavers organization. And we're going to have a wide-ranging conversation with Dom about themes linked to capacity building of organizations of persons with disabilities, about the Global Disability Summit, because Dom was quite immersed in the Global Disability Summit in 2018 and is quite involved in the Global Disability Summit taking place in 2022, which is going to happen in less than a month from now. And when we talk about all these exciting issues, we'll also get a peek into who Dominic is. So before we have our conversation with Dom, a little bit of description about myself. Right now, I'm in the studio. I'm wearing a black buttoned-up shirt. I'm wearing a gray jacket, blue glasses. There's a white wall behind me, and there's a white cup in front of me, and I'm having a coffee. And Dom is in Brighton. So Dom, how is Brighton treating you this Tuesday morning?
Yeah, hi Gagan. It's very sunny today actually, which is nice. It's quite cold, but the sun out is always a good thing. I'm quite into growing plants and vegetables and things like that. So the rain is good, but the sun is better.
Absolutely. So Dom, would you like to just describe yourself briefly, and then we could dive deep into the questions linked to the Global Disability Summit and capacity building? The floor is yours.
Sure.
Yeah.
So so physically I have a white wall background behind me and a door over my right shoulder, which will be on the left side of your screen, which has some glass panes in it and a mirror behind that. So hopefully you can see the front of me and not the back of me at the same time, because that might get a bit confusing. I'm actually wearing full running gear, Gagan, because after our chat, I have an appointment with my cross trainer, which has been a friend to me during lockdown at various points. So I'm in a black gilet and a black running top and a pair of black running shorts and some sneakers. So it's not the attire I would have chosen had I been coming into the studio, which I would have loved to have done. But given you're in my home, I think it's probably okay for me to be in running gear.
Yeah, we complement each other pretty well, with me with my gray jacket and you with your running gear out there.
Absolutely, and you definitely win hands down on the jewelry front, Gagan, as well, as we've just been talking about.
Yeah. No, but like it's good to hear your voice, Dom, and it's a shame that you could not have been here with us in the studio. We would have liked you to be here in Oslo, but this is how we circumnavigate the challenge of having this important conversation with you, because we're pretty excited to have you here with us because of the upcoming Global Disability Summit, and at least with the use of technology, with the use of Zoom and other tools, that we are able to have this conversation, and we really appreciate your time and input. So before we go into the nitty-gritty about the topics, Dom, why don't you just tell us who Dominic Haslam is, your biography a little bit, and your work?
Yeah, sure, can do, Gagan. And firstly, just to say thank you to yourself and thanks to the Atlas Alliance for this invitation. It's a great opportunity to kind of go into some of the issues in a bit more detail than you normally get the chance to do, because we have a bit more time. So that's great. Thank you. And I really appreciate the initiative that Atlas is taking with these podcasts. I've had a chance to take a look at a couple of previous episodes, so really good food for thought. Thank you. My name's Dom Haslam, always Dom, unless you're my mum and I'm in trouble, in which case Dominic. So Dom Haslam. So I grew up in London, in the northwest part of London. So for any of you who know London well, it's a place called Harlesden and also in Brixton, both of which were incredibly vibrant places to grow up. Lots of issues, lots of inequality, a fair deal of poverty. And certainly a lot of kind of human rights issues, which were really apparent to me from quite an early age, particularly around race. So both areas which have a high Black and minority ethnic population, and quite a lot of first and second generation immigrants from the West Indies in particular, but also from Asian communities as well. So it was a great place to grow up in lots of ways. It was a challenging place to grow up in some ways as well, but great in terms of diversity, in terms of culture. I mean, the food was magnificent, and the music as well. So that was a great kind of view into the wider world. And I guess from quite an early age as well, I had a very clear sense of the wider world. My father worked in a number of different human rights areas. He was also a minister, but focused very much on a kind of global ministry. So was very involved in issues such as apartheid in South Africa, and others that people really weren't talking about. So Namibia and Angola and Nicaragua and so on. So I did grow up with a very clear sense of kind of the wider world out there, and I really appreciate that background. I think it's given me a really solid footing for some of the work that I do today, and also some of the early understanding of issues of poverty and inequality, even in high income countries like the UK.
Yeah, wow. Like, since you talked about apartheid, I was just thinking about just yesterday was the MLK Day. We were commemorating Martin Luther King and his legacy, and how he tirelessly fought for social justice, reducing inequality, combating poverty, making sure that racial inclusion takes place. And that kind of laid a bedrock, for instance, for other movements across the globe, including the disability inclusion movement. So yeah, it's fascinating to hear your story, that how you were born in that specific northeastern part of London. Because generally, we would think about London, we'll think about all the upscale streets and the good life and the great ambience.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of poverty as well. I mean, it's interesting that you talk about Martin Luther King Day. I was actually having a conversation with Vladimir Chuk of the International Disability Alliance yesterday evening. I think you're speaking with him later on today.
Yeah.
And he was he's normally incredibly smartly dressed like you are, but he wasn't. He was very much in mufti yesterday. So I asked him why, and he talked about Martin Luther King Day being a holiday in the US, and I thought that was quite ironic, because if there's one thing I think Martin Luther King probably did very little of, is taking holidays. So celebrating him by having a day off work, for me, maybe celebrating him by doing more work on his day probably makes sense as well.
You're spot on. He was a man of action, and so are you, and so is Vladimir. And of course, as Riley pointed out, I'll get a chance to have this similar conversation with him later today. I'm so looking forward to that. But if we could just now pivot towards your work life, because you give a fantastic snapshot of your biography in a way, which kind of helped you, shaped you, molded you as an individual, and which kind of led you to be in the space where you are working right now. So from whatever I gathered, and I mentioned in the beginning of the podcast as well, that you are the chairperson of IDDC, and also the director of Sightsavers. Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about those organizations and your work in those organizations?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, just stepping forward a few years. So I studied at the University of Manchester, which is another great UK city further north than London. And I studied quite a wide-ranging degree called BA Economics. So it included some economics, but also a lot of international relations, international studies, feminism, political philosophy, and so on. So a really good kind of wide grounding in the social sciences, which I really appreciated, because while I think specialists in specific areas are always valuable, I think also being able to look across the various different ways of studying society, history, politics, sociology, culture, and so on is really important, and that's kind of stood me in good stead. And I went straight from there into the international development area, and I've never left. So there's part of me that feels I've never done a day's work in my life, because I've enjoyed almost every one of them, and feel really passionate about the work that we do at Sightsavers and also at IDDC. So I did a stint at Christian Aid. I did work on government relations and some humanitarian work as well. So I was in and out of places like Sierra Leone and Burundi during their civil conflicts, civil wars. And then from Christian Aid moved to Water Aid. So I got a very good background. I probably know more about sanitation than anyone would really want to know. And a brief stint at the UK Network Bond before I came to Sightsavers. So I've been at Sightsavers for 16 years in a couple of weeks' time, so quite a long time, and have done various different roles there and seen a real reshaping of the organisation in that time, which I'm really proud to have been part of, and I think relates really closely to some of the conversations we're going to have around capacity strengthening and the role of allies as well as the role of OPDs. I think Sightsavers is a good example. I would say that I've been there 16 years. I don't want to feel it's been a waste of time. But then, about 3.5, nearly 4.5 years ago, actually, took over as chair of the International Disability and Development Consortium, which is a network of over 30 fantastic members, various different types from across the world now, moving away from a European focus. We now have American members and Canadian members and so on. So it's it's a very privileged position to be in, and affords a lot of opportunity to kind of look across the scope of what allies and OPDs are doing, as well as focusing very much on the day-to-day job at Sightsavers.
Absolutely, yeah. And like the two things which kind of stuck out in this response from my standpoint, like the first thing is you using the word allies on a couple of occasions. And second, the fact that you said that you love your work and you feel that you have never had an honest day of work. And what I was reminded of is that if you love your work, then you are not working anymore, because it's something which just happens naturally. It's just a part of your existence, and it's natural to you. It comes naturally. So yeah. So coming to the first thing about this allyship and roping in the perspectives linked to capacity building, capacity bridging, capacity development, in the domain of disability and development in general, but also specifically zeroing in on OPDs, Organization of Persons with Disabilities. Do you want to dwell a little longer about the work of Sightsavers in this domain, like for instance, capacity building for OPDs in the Global South?
Yeah, sure, I can do that. I mean, maybe I'll just touch base first a little bit generally around IDDC, because
sure.
Obviously I know some of the members quite well and some of the work that they're doing, others less so. I think one of the really interesting things about IDDC is that although we have a lot of allies as members, ranging from organisations where disability is a relatively small part of the portfolio, like Save the Children, but also to organisations which have disability as a very strong part of their portfolio, like Sightsavers, Light for the World, CBM, Humanity and Inclusion, and so on. But we also have OPD members, particularly from the Scandinavian countries, and that's really been interesting. So I was fascinated listening to the session you had with Mette Muller Christensen from DPOD, for example, talking about the particular ways that they work and the particular role that they can play in what I guess you would term capacity bridging. So bringing people with disabilities and organizations of people with disabilities from the global north together with the global south. And I think she used the phrase, the magic that happens as a result. And that was, it was great to hear. And great to hear it expressed in that way, because it was a little bit more personal than perhaps sometimes the movement talks about itself, and that was good to see. So there's a really wide range of different approaches, different organisations that are taken. But I think before I come into Sightsavers, just reflecting a little bit generally on the context, because I think there's been a real power shift in the context within the movement and in terms of relationships with allies. So when I talk about this, it's from that perspective of shift, and I think a really positive shift. So the spaces to talk about disability rights, the spaces to advocate around disability were very much claimed by allies up until relatively recently, let's say 5-6 years ago. So members of the UN ECOSOC accreditation, people who could get into the UN system and talk directly to decision makers and power holders, and spaces at the national level, a lot of those spaces were taken by allies. Now, that's not to criticize that approach. It was allies doing what they felt they could. But I think that the context is very different now. I think that not just at the international level, where the International Disability Alliance and others have a very clear role and a very good working relationship with structures such as the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy Team and specific UN organizations, but also at the national level. So, when we're talking about the Global Disability Summit, where conversations are happening in countries across the world between civil society and government, as allies, we're being told by government that we need to include OPDs in those conversations,
yes,
and that those conversations aren't valid without OPDs being included. Yes. That's very different to even 5, 6, 7 years ago, and it's happening in a number of countries, and that's a fantastic context to be working in.
Yeah, no, you're spot on, because I think that this is a good positive development taking place after the popularization of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and its global ratification by countries across the world. And also, when you said about 6 years or so, the positive developments which are taking place, I'm reminded of this incredibly significant fundamental document, the Sustainability Development Goals, which, unlike the Millennium Development Goals, talks about disability, which has targets linked to persons with disabilities, girls and women with disabilities, and their social economic well-being. So you're right that the context is changing. And you mentioned about this word capacity bridging, and we also talk about capacity building and capacity development. Often when these terms pop up, we think about the Global South, which is getting the knowledge, resources, technical expertise from the Global North. And there's a little bit of power imbalance which exists, or which has existed for quite a long time. How do you see with that evolving, changing, or staying the same? Because you talked about the changing of the context.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely changing. Again, in my time at Sightsavers, the way that we work has fundamentally shifted from 2006 when I joined to 2022, and in the right way, which creates its own challenges. And I think, particularly at the moment, there's a significant pressure on OPDs in the Global South, particularly at the kind of national umbrella level, but also, within national bodies and regional bodies, because so much is expected of organizations which have few resources. And that's something that allies can support with. But it's not just a question of growing instantly and growing immediately. You have to grow in a way which works for you organizationally and is sustainable, because otherwise we're creating perhaps new levels of dependency. So if an umbrella body gets significant financial resources from an ally, and then that ally decides, actually, I don't want to work in this country anymore, what's the status of that national umbrella body at that point? Where does it get those financial resources from? So I think that's a conversation that's still happening, and it's a good conversation to have, because it is about trying to make sure that organizations are sustainable, that they're governed well, that they're running as independently as possible, given that there is that financial power imbalance. So that's one kind of aspect. I think the other thing for me is this constant kind of challenge of the role of allies. So the capacity development of OPDs means that allies have to continually challenge ourselves to think about what's our added value here. And one of the most obvious added values in the past, even up until now, really, is the fact that we work in multiple contexts. We work in several countries, several regions, maybe 50 countries, maybe 6 regions. And so we have that ability to talk across countries and to learn from different contexts and see what works and see ways of working that perhaps could be scaled up, could be taken from one country to another and so on. And that's a really powerful piece of learning and something that I think is quite valuable to organizations which are only focused in their context and in their country. But now that's starting to change as well. So now you have stronger regional bodies in Africa, for example, the Africa Disability Forum, less so in South Asia yet, but also in the Pacific. and in Latin America and so on. So OPDs themselves are starting to play some of those bridging roles and some of those multi kind of national conversations. And I think that bridging word is important because in order to do effective bridging between the North and South, there needs to be effective bridging within the South first. And that's one of the ways of addressing that power imbalance. So if as site savers or any of the members of IDDC, if you're coming into the conversation saying we work in 20 countries and we have bases in 4 European countries and in America and somewhere else, how does the national umbrella body enter that conversation with that organization that has all of these multiple resources, multiple countries, multiple learning contexts?
Yes.
And so being able to kind of talk across countries and for OPDs to be challenging, let's say, constructively, but challenging those allies to work in the most effective ways. They also need to be talking amongst themselves and presenting a kind of united front and having that conversation about what they want. And I think the International Disability Alliance has had a really fundamental role in that shift, but also its regional members. And I really hope that we can start to see development of those strong regional bodies in other regions, particularly for me, South Asia. And I know there are conversations happening around that, and it's tricky, but I think that's a clear aim for the movement as a whole in the next few years.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's a lot to unpack in that answer which you gave, and I personally also like the idea of capacity bridging or capacity developing or development, because the moment you say capacity building, there's a little bit of a subtone to it, an undercurrent to it, that perhaps we are going to a place where there's nothing, and you have to kind of build it up from the grassroots up. It's like a green field, and you have to build all the structures, put all the processes, train all the people, have everything starting from the scratch. But as you said, that in many countries there are already movements, strong individuals, powerful organizations which are advocating for rights of persons with disabilities. There are countries which have laws, legislation, policies concerning disability inclusion already in place. The important thing is what you mentioned: how do we facilitate, enable an interchange of ideas, knowledge, practices across different countries? Because, for instance, inclusive education, inclusive livelihood, discrimination against persons with disabilities, stigmatization of persons with disabilities, inaccessibility of infrastructure. All these are barriers which percolate across different country contexts. These are not only specific to one country, one region. So it's fantastic. It's kind of like music to my ears when I hear the African Disability Forum gaining in strength, and I hope that South Asian region as well also has stronger, cohesive representation taking place at a regional level as well. So that's wonderful, Dom. But are there any specific projects from SiteSaver or from your work from IDDC concerning the OPD and concerning the capacity bridging or capacity development of OPD, which you are really proud of, or which you find a success story which you want to highlight or accentuate?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of particular programs which I think are great. I think I'd like to talk about an approach that we're starting to take, which is quite a shift for us, and which I think is really important in that power imbalance discussion that we were having, and that's around ensuring that OPDs are paid for their expertise and their time.
Yes.
So what we used to have was very much a kind of project by project funding approach. So we want to work on inclusive education in Uganda. Who are the OPDs that we want to work with? And getting those OPDs on board, and then giving them a grant for the activities that they undertake, and not core funding, but grant funding. But what we wanted to do was defined by us. So we wanted to do an inclusive education project. So we bring in the OPDs that we think are going to help us with that, not sitting down with OPDs and saying, what are your priorities and who's best placed to work on those with us, And how do we make sure that you're resourced for the time and the expertise that you bring into the program, which is a very different conversation and one that we're very much starting to have. So instead of now saying, okay, well, we'll consult with you and you tell us how you can be involved and then we'll pay you for specific activities, what we're doing now is saying, well, we want you to come in at the beginning of the process to tell us what it is that you think needs to be done, to work with us on designing that program, on implementing that program, and you will be paid for the costs of your expertise and your time, which is much more flexible funding, which is what's required and what's needed, rather than this, you can survive if you do what we want you to do. And I'm, again, I'm being blunt here. I'm sure that wasn't what was in our minds when we were having those conversations, but it's the reality of how it feels and how it comes across, and it's the reality of that kind of power shift. So I think that constant challenge to ourselves to recognise that as much as we're working on ourselves, so speaking about Sightsavers, as much as we're working on ourselves to be a more inclusive organisation internally, as much as we're trying to practice what we preach, we have an internal disability inclusion working group, we have a disabled employees network, for example, both of which are relatively recent initiatives that have been quite powerful for us. However, though that process goes, we will still be an ally. We will never be an OPD. And we need to kind of recognise that and understand that. And the moment where I forget that, and I forget that I'm coming into this discussion as an outsider, I'm not a person with disability and I don't represent an OPD, the moment we forget that is the moment where we start to be part of the problem and not part of the solution. And I think that kind of constant internal challenge, but also being reminded of it, as I constantly am by friends within the movement, at the moment we forget that, I think is where the problem is. So that's a constant challenge for us, and something that I'm really pleased that we're taking seriously and really trying to take steps on. So for me, it's more about that approach and that way of thinking rather than specific programs, because I could list lots that I'm very, very proud of.
Yes.
One thing I would say that I think has been very interesting, again, for Sightsavers is the relationship that's developed with the International Disability Alliance over the last few years. So I think Vladimir Chuk and myself first started talking 2-3 years before the Sustainable Development Goals Summit in 2015 about this process of making the MDGs more inclusive, of having disabilities specifically in the Sustainable Development Goals and targets. And that started what's become a really strong alliance, if you like, between IDA and Sightsavers. And so when we're thinking about what we want to do in the disability inclusion and development space, they're the first people that we would go and talk to and say, okay, what do you want to do? This is what we want to do. How do we do this together? What does that look like? Yes. And how can you be involved in a much more day-to-day way with thinking and the implementation of Sightsavers programs, and vice versa? What can Sightsavers bring to the table aside from money that adds value to what IDA wants to do and what IDA's trying to achieve? And that's a phenomenally powerful part of our social inclusion portfolio now, and I hope that continues long into the future, long after I've gone.
No, we want you to continue for a long, long time, Dom, because you're doing a phenomenal job out there. And the two things which kind of sparked my interest from that last intervention which you made. The first being that when you said about paying the disabled people and treating them as individuals who have expertise and who are spending time on issues. And it's so important to mention this because for far too long, persons with disabilities have been consulted, but in a pro bono capacity, that we don't value you as an expert. It has to be a non-disabled person who is going to be sitting and writing those reports, narrative reports, and writing all the documents, creating the budgets, because we are the ones who understand. What would you understand, being a disabled person, about your life condition, about the barriers, and about the things which bother you in the society where you find yourself, or the context you find yourself. So it's so important to kind of give them the signal that we value you, we acknowledge you, we appreciate your time and expertise as an equal partner.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, I think there's a wider connection to the, let's call it the international development industry, because it is an industry, and I think that fits with some of the Black Lives Matter and the wider kind of global context that we're operating in, at that power dynamic. Yes. So if we look at the the aid industry as an industry, how many consultants, international development consultants, are being paid $350 a day, $500 a day, $900 a day?
Yes.
And how many individuals who are benefiting, and I use that in inverted commas, so I'm doing the bunny ear thing, how many people who are benefiting from international development programs are getting $350 a day out of those programs? I'd say none.
Absolutely. And that was precisely my point, because the moment you kind of money is a substitute, it's a proxy to giving a signal to the individual that we value you as an individual. We value your voice. We value your expertise. We value your knowledge. We value your time. We appreciate the fact that you can bring all these perspectives to the table, be it perspectives linked to accessibility audit, how to make buildings, processes, systems, structures more accessible, be it doing the barrier analysis of the systems, and so on. We are not going to just take you for granted and say, okay, yes, we are dealing in the domain of persons with disabilities, but we are going to just consult them from a distance, keep them at arm's length, and not make them own the process of finding solutions to the problems which they know how to solve the best because they are encountering it in the context with the financiers. Yeah.
And if I may, I might go into slightly controversial territory here, Gagan. So
Sure.
I'll just be clear that I'm speaking as Dom Haslam now and not on behalf of any organisation.
Go for it, Dom. Yeah.
Thank you. So for me, that's also a part of the shift that needs to happen, and I think is starting to happen within the disability movement itself. Because if you're passionate about the human rights of people with disabilities, if you're a representative of an OPD, if you're a person with disability, and you're presented with this space where you can go and have influence, where you can make people think differently and work differently and be more inclusive, in the same way that I talk about, not ever having felt I've worked a day in my life, then you jump into that space, whether you're paid or not, because it's why you do what you do. It's what you passionately believe in, and it's your mission, if you like. So it's really easy to get into a space where you don't charge and you don't ask and you don't expect to charge, because the value that you get from that interaction is in the outcome of it and is in what happens as a result.
Yes.
And I think that's led to this dynamic where it's very easy for institutions, governments, organizations like mine to come in and not pay for those services because we aren't asked to. And that's our fault. But nonetheless, there's a shared responsibility there as well. And I think that conversation is happening much more. I think certainly at the national level, at least, I think OPDs are much more challenging about that. And just to be clear, Sightsavers isn't there yet. We're on a journey. So we still get complaints from partners that we work with about our ways of working and about ways that we valued and brought OPDs into discussion. So we're not perfect by any stretch, and we'll continue learning. But I think at least that challenge is now happening in a way that it didn't happen in the past. And that's a great conversation.
No, absolutely. And that's why, for instance, just to say that encapsulate what you said with regards to often the work which we do, you could classify it as labor of love or a passion project, and then you could be so immersed in it that you might not even be bothered to even ask remuneration for it, and be happy to do it pro bono. But also there's this element of the north-south dynamic, and there's this long legacy of the colonization and imperial legacy, which kind of makes it much more difficult for the organizations of persons with disabilities working in the South to be critical, to be assertive, to say that we want this funding and we would like to spend it on these projects. And if you give us the money, then we could deliver. And that conversation, as you said, it's very recent, and I'm so happy that it's happening, because we need a shift, a power shift, a focus shift with regards to making this, as you said, the aid industry more inclusive on one hand. And on the other hand, when you mentioned about the human rights of persons with disabilities, 1 billion people with disabilities, globally speaking, are there. 80% or more live in the global South. And most of the development aid flows $150 billion, 150 billion euros every year, more give or take, flows from north to south. So it's incumbent on us to encourage, when I say us, we sitting in Norway and you sitting out there in Britain, to kind of have that inclusive conversation. And of course, the podcast is Road to Inclusion. It's a journey which we are taking together. Yeah. So I'm so happy to hear that Sightsavers is actually taking steps to make itself more inclusive and to ensure that that kind of power imbalance is addressed accordingly. So now, if we may take like a little pivot towards the Global Disability Summit, because Dom, you have been immersed, involved, engaged with Global Disability Summit 2018. Were there some specific lessons which you learned, which you would want to share with us, which could kind of help in these last few weeks left for Global Disability Summit 2022 to take place, and then after 2022 as well?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ken. I mean, the first thing which I think Atlas has already learned is don't underestimate how much work it takes to put on an event like this.
Absolutely. So I second you.
Yeah, so I'm probably too late in sharing that lesson. I apologize, but hopefully whoever organizes the next one will have a listen and learn that lesson a little bit earlier. So yeah, I mean, look, it was 2018 was a fantastic moment. It was a fantastic event. For me, if you like, if we look at kind of the global journey on disability and international development specifically, the step from the CRPD to the SDGs and then to the Global Disability Summit in the UK and now to the Global Disability Summit in Norway, I think that's a really clear road to inclusion, if you like, using the title again.
Yes.
So I think 2018 was a fantastic moment. I think that there are lots of lessons coming out from there. I think for me, one of the most powerful learnings was around how easy it is for international development organizations to get disconnected from the domestic environment that they're working in. So again, I'm going to be a bit controversial, so I'm speaking on behalf of myself. But if we look at the UK policy context in 2018 around disability rights, it was pretty appalling. If we look at the track record on CRPD reporting, it's not good at all. And the kind of the space for OPDs based in the UK, or DPOs, I think the UK organisations would still call themselves, but the space for them to get involved in domestic policy making, to be listened to be consulted, to have a genuine voice, was very limited. And so for them, the holding of a summit hosted by the UK government, talking about all the great things that the UK was doing everywhere else in the world except in the UK, was a real, I think it's fair to say, a real kick in the teeth. And so there was a lot of difficult negotiation and discussion between the international OPDs, so with IDA, with the European Disability Forum being very involved in the conversation as well, with those UK DPOs about how the summit could be a bit of a space for them to talk about domestic policy and to raise those issues. And that was really uncomfortable for organisations like Sightsavers and the other UK kind of IDDC members and disability inclusive development organisations, because we don't engage in domestic policy unless you count international development as domestic policy, which it isn't really. So we're not really involved in that space. And so that was a real challenge for us and something to really learn about. And I think, I know it's already a conversation that Atlas is having internally and with the Norwegian government, but I think it should be an opportunity for Norwegian OPDs to have that conversation with Norway about what are you doing here? Because it's all very well and good going back to this practice what you preach thing. It's all very well and good telling other people what to do. I get paid to tell other people what to do all the time, and that's a really privileged position to be in. But if you're not looking at yourself at the same time, you don't have any right to tell other people what to do. In my view, I think it's the worst kind of advocacy in the same way as it would be the worst kind of parenting. Do what I say, not what I do. It's not a compelling message. There's a real challenge for GLAD members, Global North governments who are engaged and interested in disability inclusive development. I think there's a real challenge there to say, okay, how do you take this conversation into your own context at the same time? How do you domesticate the CRPD? How are you implementing the CRPD in all of its articles and in all of your policies, and not just in the articles around international development or in your development policies, because you should be doing both.
Absolutely. I think there has to be this element of complementarity when it comes to disability inclusion. Of course, there has to be international development disability focus because a vast majority of people live in the global south. As I mentioned, 80%, almost more than 800 million people with disabilities live in the global south in much more dire circumstances and appalling conditions. But at the same time, there is this local domestic focus. There are persons with disabilities in Norway. 17 to 18% of Norwegian population has a disability. 23% of the population in the United States has a disability. So it's kind of imperative if you want to retain a sense of moral legitimacy and not be seen as a hypocrite in a way. Imagine if, as you poignantly and eloquently stated, you are just preaching from the pulpit nonstop, being an amazing minister about stay away from all the sinful behavior. And the next thing you know is that you just come off the pulpit and there you go for the 7 sins. let them come in.
The behaviour of ministers is an area of controversy I'm not going to get involved in on this podcast.
Absolutely, well, that's true. But that was just an anecdote, an example which should be taken in the context of the conversation. But at the same time, what I'm more interested in, what you said about making sure that the domestic DPOs, OPDs in Norway kind of put the pressure on the Norwegian government and says that, okay, we have this huge global disability summit taking place in Norway for the second time in the history of the GDS and the first time in Norway. How could we use it as a positive catalyst to promote and center disability inclusion? You mentioned about the domestication of CRPD. If I may just add one sentence about that, like Norway has ratified UN CRPD, but it has not incorporated it into the Norwegian law. Although Norway in the past has incorporated the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and other older human rights convention. But when it comes to the CRPD, suddenly the conversation becomes, this is too political. This is too expensive to implement. So we will just give it a pass. Thrice it has happened. So perhaps that might be an opportunity which the Norwegian OPDs might take up to lobby for and learn from what you mentioned, have the complementarity, the international with the domestic focus on disability inclusion. Fantastic. Dom, about the GDS 2022, it's happening in less than a month. What are your expectations concerning the Global Disability Summit? What are your aspirations from the Global Disability Summit 2022?
Yeah, thanks again. Yeah, thanks for reminding me it's only a month away. I have to say, every time I go on the GDS website and see the day ticker and the hour ticker and the minute ticker going down, it gives me palpitations to think how short a time we've got because there's so much to do.
Absolutely.
I think obviously the fact that it's second gives us a really good opportunity to review the impact of what happened in the UK in 2018. And we should just be clear that, yes, it was held in the UK, but it was co-hosted by Kenya and by the International Disability Alliance. And it's an opportunity to reflect on that. What did the commitment bring to the process? Because as I was saying on a webinar last week, it's great talking about commitments and commitments to talk more about commitments. Those are all fantastic processes. But the reality is nobody's promised to do anything under the Global Disability Summit that if they've signed and ratified the CRPD, they haven't already promised to do. So these aren't new promises in any sense. What they are is a commitment to do things that fit within the CRPD, hopefully, because otherwise they shouldn't be accepted as commitments, but which are about implementing and practically putting into place those promises that they already made, in some cases a decade or more ago, under the CRPD, and also the promises they made under the SDGs. So if we look at education, they've all already made a commitment for universal education. They've all already made a commitment to universal healthcare. And universal education and universal healthcare, guess what? That includes people with disabilities.
Yes.
So those commitments have already been made. So what for me is interesting is looking at, well, what did making those commitments shift in terms of the kind of road to inclusion, in terms of the road to implementation of the convention? And one of the things I think it really has shifted is some of the national level debate and discussion and dialogue that's happening in lots of countries all over the world around these commitments. So some of the conversations which Sightsavers helped facilitate between government and OPDs in 2017 going into the summit in 2018, those are discussions that are still happening now. They've happened from 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021. And that's way more powerful and important to me than whether somebody's ticked a box and said, I've made this commitment and I've met this commitment. That ongoing day-to-day, month-to-month, year-to-year conversation is exactly what we want to achieve and we want to push. And for me, the GDS has created a space for that wasn't there before. And that's the most important impact I think it had. And I really hope that 2022 sees more of those conversations happening in a wider range of countries. And again, Sightsavers and I know a lot of other IDDC members are very involved in facilitating and brokering those conversations. And as I said earlier, in some cases being challenged to back out of that space a bit and make sure that the OPDs are at the centre of it. So for me, that's what I'm looking for, is more governments making those commitments, not the commitments themselves. I'm not going to say I don't care about those, because that would be ridiculous. I care about them less than I care about the conversations that are happening as a result and will continue to happen. And if that takes this kind of framework and this kind of process, then great. So be it. If it's easier to get those conversations happening under this framework than it is under a CRPD framework, then my answer would be we need both. And that the ones that we're having under the GDS framework need to be a starting point for CRPD-led conversations, because the CRPD is always going to be wider and broader and more comprehensive than any government set of commitments under the GDS. So that's what I'm really hoping for. I'm really sad, obviously, that we're not all coming together, because I think the Civil Society Forum that we held in the UK was a brilliant moment of bringing so many representatives of OPDs and allies together into one space and challenging power and authority. So not having that space to do that physically together is really difficult. However, it does give us an opportunity that we didn't have in the UK, which is for far more voices to be heard, far more people from the global south to listen to and hear those conversations and comment in chat boxes and put questions to panelists and so on, because we couldn't fly everybody over to the UK. But we can provide access to a lot of people through the technology that many have access to. Not as many as we'd like, but many will have access to that technology. And I think, that's a real opportunity as well. So those are probably the two things that I'm most looking forward to. But I'm very sad I won't be tasting Norwegian food, particularly fish, because you do have some pretty remarkable fish dishes.
Absolutely. Dom, next time around, we'll get a chance to have the fish. But from whatever I gathered from your last intervention or input, was that, of course, it's good to make the commitments. It's good to have the commitments, but you got to walk the talk when it comes to implementing these commitments. These commitments are already there in the CRPD, already there in the Sustainability Development Goals, already there from the Global Disability Summit 2018. And now the new ones are coming. The important thing is to put the quote-unquote duty bearers' feet to the proverbial fire and to make them accountable. And on 12th January 2022, there was a pre-summit for Global Disability Summit. And I heard one learned gentleman talk a little bit about being action-oriented. Does that ring a bell, Dom?
It does ring a bell. If I'm a learned gentleman, does that age me, Gagan? I hit 50 this year. I'm already worrying about my age.
No, the important thing is that it's important to be action oriented. It's commitments. If they're just on a piece of paper, that's noble rhetoric. That's a good starting point. That's when the conversation begins. But that's not where the conversation should conclude. We've got to implement. We've got to follow up, and that's why I think beyond February 2022, when the GDS is over in Norway, what happens next? How do we follow up with the governments, with the donors, with the multilateral organizations about the projects, programs which they are implementing in the global south as well as in the north? So, Dom, as an individual and as a representative of IDDC and Sightsavers, what would you like to accomplish from the GDS 2022? If there's one thing, just one thing you would definitely want to accomplish, what would that be?
So I think again, it's about bringing more governments into that conversation. So having a wider range of governments and making commitments for me is really important. But the other thing I would say, which is very different to 2018, is that there's much more focus this time around on the private sector, and that's really interesting for me. So one of the programs I'm proudest of at Sightsavers at the moment is our inclusive employment program, and what that's doing is opening up conversations with massive multilateral or multinational organizations, companies which employ and have relationships with organizations in their supply chain that employ millions of people globally, and getting them to change the way that they act, getting them to change the way that they work internally to become more inclusive, not only in themselves, but in their supply chains, right the way down to kind of local levels and locally run organizations and individual farmers and producers and so on. That will have a phenomenal impact on the rights of persons with disabilities, not only directly in terms of pay in their pocket and so on, but in terms of what that gives you in terms of say in your community, say in your family, your sense of value and how other people perceive your capability. And that has the opportunity to have a really wide ranging impact. So for me, taking some of those lessons from working with some of those companies, which I have found to be really fantastically open to this conversation, much more than perhaps we thought when we started the program. And I should say we're running that program in conjunction with and in partnership with IDA and with OPDs in all of the countries where we're working. For me, getting private sector making commitments, that is a shift. Because private sector organisations aren't signatories to the CRPD. Yes. So there is no framework for them at the moment. There might be some national legislation, but we all know the issues around disability employment quotas, how easy it is to circumvent them by paying fines or by putting people with disabilities in low-paying jobs or whatever it might be. So we know that's easy to do. So actually getting them to make their own commitments and say this is what we want to do, that could have a phenomenal impact. So I'm really pleased to see that the summit's broadening out into those other different types of actors.
I really like the way you're talking about casting the net wide as possible and engaging with the private sector, because if you think about disability inclusion, it's responsibility for everybody. It cannot be only the task of an OPD or a DPO or person with disabilities. We need allies. We need mainstream organizations. We need a ready involvement of private sector if we want to ensure that the Article 27 work and employment of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities gets implemented and gets actual, real, tangible outcomes. Otherwise, we're just scratching the surface of the problem, what you mentioned about inclusive employment. So that's fantastic. Kudos to you and Sightsavers for having that initiative with the private sector. And Dom, if I may take 2 steps back, and now I would like to intersect these 2 elements, if I may. One being the capacity bridging, capacity developing of the OPD angle, and the other being the Global Disability Summit. So when I think about capacity development, I think about 3 levels to it. One being the external enabling environment, which has laws, policies, structures, institutions, regulations. Second being the organizations which are working on the ground, like Organization of Persons with Disabilities. And third being the individuals who are there, who need to be trained and so on. So how do you see the Global Disability Summit 2022 contributing to this specific commitment? That how do we ensure that there is capacity development taking place within the OPD space moving forward in 2022 and beyond in the Global South?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Gagan, and I guess it kind of goes back a little bit to what do commitments mean, and are they words, are they pieces of paper, or are they something about action? I mean, I think that there are governments which are working closely with allies to support capacity bridging and capacity strengthening. So the UK government program, which Sightsavers is leading a wide range of organisations, both OPDs and NGOs and IDBC members, in collaborating together and working together on finding common solutions to problems. But also the Norwegian government is also putting significant funding through the Atlas Alliance and through others to address the same kinds of issues. So I think some of it is about sharing what's working and about being really honest about that, because I think, what tends to happen when you get international organizations into a space like the Global Disability Summit is everybody talks about how brilliant they are and how much they've done
Yes.
and how everything they've done has worked.
Yes.
So it's like a convention of King Midas. Everything we've touched has turned to gold. And obviously the reality is that that's so far from the truth. It's crazy. So I think, a bit of challenging ourselves to be really honest about what's working. And that's both the allies and the donor organizations, but also the OPDs. That honesty, I think, is really critically important, because there definitely are positive lessons that we can learn, but there are also negative lessons that we can learn from. And
Sure.
if we don't share that negative learning, then we're doing ourselves and we're doing the movement and we're doing, in the end, 1 billion people a disservice. So that honesty I'd really be looking for, and that challenge to ourselves. But also I'd really like to see some specific commitments about this. What does that mean?
Yes.
And in this, I'm not suggesting that OPD should be making commitments too, but I do think, if I had a challenge back to the movement, one of the things for me that I think really does need looking at is representation within the movement itself.
Yes.
Because I think the more that we say you must consult with national umbrella bodies, you have to engage umbrella bodies from the start, from the beginning, the more vital it is that when those bodies are brought into processes and do speak, that they are genuinely representing individuals with disabilities within their countries, within their communities. So that includes women, it includes young people, it includes some of the more marginalized groups within the disability movement. It's intersectionality and so on, and not an urban, well-educated elite, and dare I say it, male in general, and perhaps slightly older group. And that's not to knock those individuals. They're very powerful voices and they have a lot of experience. But let's be clear, we want to see more women, more young people, more people with intellectual disabilities, more people with multiple disabilities. We want to see more of that kind of representation and that voice from the movement. So I'm not asking you to make that commitment on behalf of the movement, Gagan, because
I don't think I cannot dare to do that, but I actually liked your idea with regards to ensuring that when you think about voices, we should think about diverse, intersectional, pluralistic, most marginalized voices, those individuals who have been in the disability movement, also in the periphery, and to bring them back into the center, if we might. That's very, very important, because representation matters. Nothing about us without us matters. But this us has to be a very, very broad tent with the diverse perspectives and different life experiences coming together. So absolutely, Dom, we're running out of time. So for this, it's going to be 3 quick questions. Number 1, quick message to the Atlas partners, organizations, members, what we should do about the GDS 2022 is something which you would want to share with us. And how do we mobilize more allies, more mainstream organizations, and more OPDs across the globe to participate in the GDS 2022?
Yeah, so the very quick message is good luck, because we all need it.
Yes, we do.
The slightly less flippant response. I mean, I think what's great is that we're starting to communicate more around the summit. So we have I'm really pleased that the Site Savers communication team's been able to provide some support to Atlas and IDA and Norway and Ghana in communicating about the summit and getting the word out there into the wider public and hopefully into more ears than perhaps might have been the case until relatively recently. So I think, let's continue that push and that drive. Certainly, I know a lot of IDDC members are right behind you and are ready to engage at the national level, ready to push governments, ready to work with OPDs, get those commitments and those conversations happening. So I guess I'd throw it back to you a little bit. If there are things that you think we can do more of, then please shout, because we're absolutely ready to stand with you and to do what we can to make this a success.
Absolutely. It sounds wonderful to hear that IDDC and your organization Site Savers are just behind us, and being strengthening the movement together. Dom, one last thing. How did you manage this COVID situation? Like it was locked down for almost 2 years. Any hobbies you developed? How you spend time beyond your running gear and CrossFit activities?
Yeah, and Gagan, just to say, don't worry, we get confused with Save the Children all the time, but we also get confused with Specsavers, which is a UK optometrist outfit. So I'm constantly introduced the director of Specsavers in conferences, which is all good. So the cross trainer has been great. Having time with family has been great, even when we didn't have the option of not having time with each other. That's been good. So I've watched an awful lot of Buffy the Vampire Slayer with my daughter, for example. But I think one thing I'm really pleased about is that it gave me a bit of a push to dust off my bass guitar and my amp, which had been lurking under the floorboards, gathering dust for some years. So I've repicked my bass up, which I used to play quite a lot of. I used to be in a band. I was full time in a band actually for about a year.
Wow.
So I've been able to do that again, which has been great. Music's really important to me, and I've really just kind of rediscovered that active love of music by playing it and not just listening to it. So that's been cool.
Can't wait to jam and jive with you next time around when you are in Oslo, or I happen to meet you in Brighton or London or some other corner of the globe. Dom, thank you so very much for your critical, cogent, honest perspectives linked to inclusion, linked to the Global Disability Summit, linked to capacity bridging. And it's heartening to hear the work which you have been doing. And we really appreciate the fact that it took time out and talked to us about this important event which is coming up. So before we round off, please, if you get a chance, go to the globaldisabilitysummit.org website. Check out the website of IDDC. Check out the website of Sightsavers. and Dominic's work. And it was a pleasure, Dom. And good luck to all of us here who are involved in the GDS preparation. And may it be a fantastic event for all of us.
Thank you so much, Gagan. Thank you.
Yeah. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for tuning into this podcast episode. I hope you found this conversation engaging, enlightening, and a little bit entertaining. And if yes, then I hope you get a chance to follow the other episodes as well. And please subscribe and share the podcast series Road to Inclusion.